Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 18 March 2024. It is the 150th anniversary of the birth of Nikolai Alexandrovich Berdyaev, who was born in Obukhov near Kiev on this date in 1874. As with the dates for Petrum Sorokin, Berdyev's birth date was old style and was changed after he was born. So when Berdyaev was born, the calendar actually read 6 March, but this date was changed retroactively to 18 March under the Gregorian calendar. Berdyaev was, or I should say, has been called a Christian existentialist, a label that has also been applied to Gabriel Marcel, but it is, after all, just a label, and it should be taken with a grain of salt. In Berdyev's autobiography, he sounds a lot more like an idealist than an existentialist, but he also says in his autobiography that, quote, true existentialist philosophy is represented by St. Augustine, Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, rather than by Heidegger, Jaspers, or Sartre, unquote. We could say that Berdyaev is implicitly making a fallacious, no true existentialist argument, but the distinction he makes is worth noting. If you define an exemplar from the beginning, or several exemplars, as Berdyaev does, and you don't move the goalpost in the course of an argument, it isn't a fallacy to insist upon what is a true existentialist and what is not a true existentialist by the stipulation that you established at the beginning. And Berdyaev has taken the trouble of doing that for us. So you can take the Christian existentialist label or leave it as you like. And Berdyaev indeed wasn't always a Christian. Like many thinkers of the 20th century, his path took him from traditional beliefs through a period of Marxism and eventually back to Christianity. At the same time, there were other philosophers who were taking the opposite journey from Christianity to Marxism. So this was a well-trodden path in both directions during the 20th century. But whatever the status of Berdyev's Marxism, his Christianity, or his existentialism, he was an aristocrat by birth. In his autobiography, he writes, quote, I myself inherited a hot and irascible temper, a tendency not uncommon among the Russian gentry, unquote. And then after that, he goes on to relate an anecdote to illustrate his temper. Quote, when I was in exile in Vologda, I struck a man, a local government official, because he pursued a young lady of my acquaintance in the street. When I had hit him, I threatened him with dismissal from his job. On such occasions, the blood of my ancestors rushed to my head. I have even known real ecstasies of rage, unquote. And after that, then he adds what I consider to be a rather telling coda to his discussion of his aristocratic background. Quote, I myself, even while engaged in revolutionary activity and a convinced social democrat, never ceased to be fundamentally, though unconsciously, a nobleman. It was so in my very repudiation of the world to which I belonged by birth and upbringing. I resented this, especially when I noticed that my origin produced a feeling of inferiority in my comrades, unquote. Like Berdyev's well-trodden path from Marxism to religion, this was also another familiar staple from the 20th century. It would be difficult to find a philosopher more different from Berdyaev than Bertrand Russell, but Berdyev's description of his aristocratic background might well have been written by Russell, although I don't think Russell assaulted anyone in the street as a result of his aristocratic hot temper, as it were. The incident in Vologda was while Berdyaev was in internal exile in Russia, starting in 1897 as a result of his revolutionary activities while at university. And years later, he was charged with blasphemy under the Tsarist government, but the revolution intervened and he was never tried for that. But he was really in no better position under the communist regime that followed the Tsarist regime. He was actually taken in for questioning and was questioned by the head of the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky, And though he wasn't shot or jailed, he was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1922. So it's difficult to pigeonhole Berdyev's views, but his thought is not entirely isolated from what others were doing about the same time in philosophy of history. For example, there is an unlikely intersection between Berdyaev and the previous two philosophers I have discussed, Raymond Aron and Patrick Gardner. At the end of Gardner's The Nature of Historical Explanation, he argues that materialist and idealist conceptions of historical explanation are based on different conceptions of what constitutes an explanation in history. Gardner writes, quote, "Whether we regard human beings in their physical aspects or in their mental aspects depends upon our interests. The physiologist is interested in the behavior of the bloodstream, the arrangement of the brain cells. The psychologist or the historian is interested in what people think, say, feel, do. There is no conflict, only a difference of point of view and purpose. Human beings are not really matter or really mind. They are human beings. Different ways of talking about them, dictated by different interests, have been hypostasized into different ingredients," unquote. In my talk on Gardner, I mentioned the influence of Gilbert Ryle, and this passage I just quoted is clearly of a piece with Ryle's denial of a ghost in the machine conception of the self. No more than mind is a ghost inhabiting a machine is the body a machine haunted by a ghost. Taken seriously, this equally calls into question mechanism and idealism, though historically among linguistic philosophers, it was primarily used to call into question any kind of idealism in regard to the self. For Gardner, the whole man, not divided between ghost and machine, is needed for an adequate historical explanation, and that could only be formulated in view of the light of the wholeness of the person. Raymond Aron was even more explicit in the implications of his philosophy of history for its inconclusiveness in the absence of an adequate philosophical anthropology. At the very end of his book, Introduction to Philosophy of History, he wrote, quote, "For man to be in entire harmony with himself, he would have to live according to the truth. He would have to recognize himself as autonomous both in his creation and in his consciousness of it. This would be an ideal reconciliation, incompatible with the destiny of those who do not set up an idol in place of God. Human life is dialectic, that is, dramatic. Since it is active in an incoherent world, is committed despite duration, and seeks a fleeting truth with no other certainty but a fragmentary science and a formal reflection," unquote. And that is the very, very last paragraph of Aron's book, but he puts a footnote under that in which he says, quote, "A philosophical inquiry, partial as is this one, allows no conclusion. The omission is inevitable and intentional. The whole of this final part transposes into anthropological terms the results already obtained in itself, represents a sort of conclusion, since it shows the meaning for life of the abstract propositions previously demonstrated," unquote. From these two examples of Patrick Gardner and Raymond Aron, I take it that they looked forward to the possibility of some kind of philosophical anthropology, Gardner implicitly and Aron explicitly, that would fill the void that remains after their analyses. But either both of them, I should say, both of them were either unwilling or unable to fill that void. Berdyaev, on the contrary, steps into the void and is prepared to supply the philosophical anthropology that Gardner and Aron apply, or perhaps we can even say that they anticipate, but they stopped short of formulating. Chapter 3 of Berdyev's book, The Destiny of Man, is his account of philosophical anthropology, and it is largely religious, though it is not you could say it's not an orthodox religious point of view that represents any particular sect or church. Quote, this is the last paragraph of his chapter on philosophical anthropology. Quote, man and humanity, the idea and the image of man, have two eternal sources in the world of antiquity, the biblical and the Hellenic. It was there that man was forced and differentiated out of the primeval chaos. But though his first sources are Hebrew, Hellenic, that's hyphenated, by the way, it was only in Christianity, through Christ and the Christian revelation, that man found himself, reached spiritual maturity, and became free from the power of the lower natural elements. In the person of Christ, the God, man has fully come to exist. The fundamental Christian conception of man is real and not symbolic. It implies his transfiguration and illumination of his created nature as man, that is, the actual attainment of the highest qualities and not a symbolic representation of non-human values in the human world. The central anthropological idea of Christianity is the idea of divine humanity, a real divinely human kingdom. Christianity leads to the deification of the human and not of the angelic or of the animal nature, because Christ was the God-man and not God-angel. Symbolic hierarchism is divinely angelic and not divinely human, unquote. Berdyaev mentions Max Scheler frequently, which is consistent with his interest in their shared interest in philosophical anthropology. Scheler also wrote a book on philosophical anthropology, very unsatisfying in my opinion. In his autobiography that I've already mentioned a couple times, Dream and Reality, he talks about his meeting Scheler in Berlin, and at the same time when he was in Berlin, he met Kaiserling and Spengler. Spengler turned out to be a bust. He was a complete disappointment for Berdyaev. Berdyaev found Scheler, as he says, quote, brilliant in conversation, unquote. But that meeting was also a disappointment. He was disappointed to find that Scheler had already separated himself from Catholicism and even from Christianity broadly considered. And he said, and I think this is accurate, quote, I felt nevertheless the lack of any dominant and integrating idea in his outlook, unquote, in Scheler's outlook, that is. Berdyaev's dominant and integrating idea was his Christian philosophical anthropology, which raised eschatology over salvation history. He expressed his dominating and integrating idea in his autobiography in a passage that is a rather helpful overview of his conception of history. Quote, Russian thought has always been preoccupied with the problems of the philosophy of history, and my own keen interest in this subject developed in accordance with the tradition of Russian thought. In setting out to understand the nature of history, I had one overwhelming impression, namely that nothing seems to succeed in history, and yet all things are significant in it. The meaning of history is beyond the confines of history. History has meaning because it comes to an end. Unending history, be it as progress or as regress, is the epitome of meaninglessness. Thus, I arrived at the conclusion that the true philosophy of history is eschatological in nature. That is to say, the historical process ought to be understood in the light of the end. The philosopher of history, therefore, speaks as a prophet who proceeds from the unknown to the known and not from the known to the unknown, unquote. But it's a journey to get from Berdyaev's philosophical anthropology to his eschatology. So I will read another quote. This is from The Fate of Man in the Modern World, and I think it gives a good sense of Berdyaev's point of origin in his coming to grips with history. Quote, man's existence in this world is an historical existence. Existence is history. Besides this, history is the tragic conflict between the personal and the superpersonal or the pre-personal. History never solves the conflict between personality and society, between personality and culture, personality and the mass, the conflict between quality and quantity. Personality is active in history. Within history, the individual is revealed, but history is merciless in its attitude toward personality and oppresses the individual. There is a meaning of history, and the recognition of this meaning belongs to Christianity, unquote. The particular way in which Berdyaev derives the meaning of history from Christianity is distinct from many, if not most, providential philosophies of history. I said earlier that Berdyaev's philosophical anthropology raises eschatology over salvation history. So what do I mean by that? We can make a distinction among religious, or I would prefer to say among providential philosophies of history, between those that claim to be predictive of worldly events, or events in this world that lead on to events in the next world, and those that seek to transcend worldly events completely. This is, interestingly, almost perfectly parallel to the distinction that can be made between historicists in Popper's sense and historicists in Ronca's sense. Popper criticized historicism as a failed and fallacious predictive science of history, believing that the task of finding laws in history is the same thing as saying that these laws can predict the future, thereby undercutting traditional speculative philosophy of history in the same motion as he is undercutting historicism, as Popper would define historicism. Ronca's historicism isn't at all about a predictive science of history, and it isn't about finding laws that govern history, but it is about taking each period on its own terms, with Ronca asserting that every period is equidistant from God. So Ronca then legitimizes his historicism by reference to a transcendence that stands outside history. Now, we could talk about the relationship of that to Berdyev's point of view, but I'm going to pass over that now. There is a way you could connect that. But we can find a similar distinction between, like I said, this conception of historicism we find in Popper and the conception of historicism we find in Ronca. We can find a similar distinction between providentialist philosophies of history. St. Augustine and Bossuet argue that God sets the course of the world and salvation history manifests in the world the evidence of divine intervention in the world. On the other hand, some philosophers who are, we could say, no less attached to the role of divine providence, eschew any realization of providence in the material world. In this camp, I would squarely place Simone Weil, and I think also I would place Berdyaev. Like Weil, Berdyaev emphasizes eternity, though while Weil was a Platonist, Berdyaev is more traditionally religious, so that his eternity is an eschatology that lies outside and beyond history. At the same time, it is an eschatology that's quite firmly rooted in the human horror of death, and so it's something that we can all understand with quite some immediacy. And I think this is why we so often hear Berdyaev referred to as an existentialist, because he is coming to grips with these concerns that were also voiced by existentialists who were largely non-religious. So here's a quote in which he makes this pretty explicit. Quote, "Death not merely makes life senseless and corruptible, it is also a sign coming from the depths of there being a higher meaning in life, not base fear, but horror and anguish which death inspires in us, prove that we belong not only to the surface, but in the depths as well, not only to temporal life, but also to eternity. While we are in time, eternity both attracts and horrifies us. We feel horror and anguish, not only because all we hold dear dies and comes to an end, but still more because we are conscious of a yawning abyss between time and eternity. Horror and anguish at having to cross the abyss contain at the same time a hope that the final meaning shall be revealed and realized. Death holds hope as well as horror for man, though he does not always recognize this or call it by an appropriate death. Not merely makes life senseless and contemptible, it is a sign coming from the depths. I think I must have accidentally repeated that quote, so sorry for the incoherence there. But I will pick it up again here. The meaning that comes from the other world is like a scorching flame to us that demands that we should pass through death. Death is not only a biological and psychological fact, but a spiritual fact as well. The meaning of death is that there can be no eternity in time and that an endless temporal series would be meaningless, unquote. My response to this is that Berdyaev has achieved an almost complete and perfect antithesis of naturalism without any condemnation or denial of the natural world, which is something we find in idealism in its various stripes. And that is an achievement in and of itself. I agree with Berdyaev that death is a spiritual fact in addition to being a biological fact, but every other claim he makes is essentially a mirror image of how I would approach the human response to death, time, and eternity. But I point out that it's an inversion of my view, but it's not a negation, because Berdyaev has identified crucial human experiences, and any philosophy of history that honestly reckons with the reality of human life, which inevitably tends to death, needs to be equally straightforward in acknowledging the horror and anguish, the desire for some consoling hope, the apparent senselessness of a life that must end, and the strange attraction that seems to be exercised by the idea of eternity. So happy birthday, Nikolai Berdyaev, and thanks for listening.